Here is something almost embarrassingly simple that is true for the majority of people who feel like they are bad with money. They have never actually written down where their money goes. Not in detail, not with real numbers. They have a rough sense: rent, some bills, groceries, stuff. But if you asked them to list their last month's spending by category with actual dollar amounts, most people could not do it with any real accuracy. This is not a character flaw. It is simply what happens by default when nobody ever taught you a framework for organizing income and spending. And most of us were never taught one, in school or otherwise. The 50-30-20 rule is one of the simplest, most durable frameworks for fixing exactly this. It is not a complicated spreadsheet. It is not a restrictive diet for your finances. It is a single, memorable ratio, 50-30-20, that gives every dollar of your income a job before you spend it, rather than discovering at the end of the month where it all went. This video explains exactly what the three numbers mean, how to apply them to your actual income, the one specific mistake that causes this framework to fail for almost everyone who first tries it, and how to adapt it when your real life, as it does for almost everyone, especially in Canada's more expensive cities, does not fit the ratio perfectly. This is foundational, evergreen content. The specific dollar amounts in your own budget will change over time. The framework itself will not. If you want to keep your money mindset sharp and learn how to make your capital work for you, consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. It truly helps the channel grow and teach people about financial education. Now, let's get right into today's breakdown. The first number, 50%, is allocated to needs, the expenses required to maintain your basic life and ability to function, regardless of preference or lifestyle choice. What genuinely counts as a need? Housing, rent or mortgage payment, including basic utilities, electricity, heat, water. Groceries, food required for basic nutrition, prepared and eaten primarily at home. Transportation required to get to work or fulfill basic life obligations. This includes public transit costs, or, if a vehicle is genuinely necessary, the minimum costs of insurance, fuel, and basic maintenance, not the car payment on a vehicle nicer than strictly required, which we will address in the wants category. Minimum debt payments, the contractually required minimum payment on any loan, credit card, or line of credit, not extra payments beyond the minimum, which belong in the savings.debt category. Insurance, health, tenant, or basic auto insurance required by law or genuinely necessary for risk protection. Basic phone and internet, a functional, not premium plan sufficient for work and essential communication. Childcare, if applicable, and required for a parent to work. What people commonly, and incorrectly, count as a need. This is where the category most often gets distorted. A larger apartment than strictly required for comfort versus genuine need is a lifestyle choice, not a need. The need is shelter. The specific size and location involve a wants component. A car payment on a newer or nicer vehicle than the minimum required for reliable transportation is a want layered on top of a genuine transportation need. A premium phone plan with more data than actually used, streaming subscriptions, and dining out are not needs, regardless of how routine or automatic they may feel. Why this distinction matters so much? If genuine needs, properly defined, exceed 50% of your income, which, particularly in Canada's most expensive housing markets, is an extremely common and entirely real situation. That is critically important information about your financial position. It tells you that either your income needs to grow, your housing or other major need costs need to decrease, often through a difficult but clarifying decision, such as relocating or finding roommates, or the 50-30-20 ratios themselves need to be adjusted for your specific situation, a point covered fully in Segment 4. If you instead inflate the needs category by including lifestyle choices, you lose the single most valuable piece of information this exercise provides: an honest picture of whether your actual cost of living, stripped of preference, fits within your income. Your action step: list your actual monthly needs using the strict definition above. Not what currently appears in your housing or transportation line items, but the genuinely minimum cost to meet that need. Compare that honest minimum to 50% of your after-tax income. The gap, in either direction, is the single most important number in this entire framework. The second number, 30%, is allocated to wants, spending that genuinely improves your quality of life, but is not required for basic survival or functioning. What counts as a want? Dining out and takeout, beyond basic at-home food needs. Entertainment, streaming subscriptions, concerts, movies, hobbies, travel and vacations. Clothing and personal care beyond basic necessity. The upgrade portion of housing or transportation. The nicer apartment than strictly required. The nicer vehicle than strictly required. The gym membership. The premium version of a phone or internet plan. Gifts, social spending, and discretionary purchases of any kind. Why this category is deliberately built into the framework, and why this matters psychologically. A common and serious mistake in personal finance content is to treat all discretionary spending as something to be minimized or eliminated entirely in pursuit of maximum savings. The 50-30-20 framework deliberately rejects this. It allocates a meaningful, intentional 30% specifically to enjoyment and quality of life, precisely because budgets that allow zero room for discretionary spending are, by an enormous body of behavioral research, dramatically more likely to fail. Extremely restrictive budgets tend to produce one of two outcomes: outright abandonment of the budget entirely within a few months, or a pattern of budget rebellion, unplanned, often larger and more frequent splurges that occur specifically because the budget felt punishing and unsustainable. A budget that includes a deliberate, guilt-free 30% for genuine enjoyment is considerably more likely to be followed consistently over the long term than one that treats all non-essential spending as a failure. The deliberate framing shift this requires. Many people, upon first encountering this category, feel an instinct to minimize it, to allocate less than 30% to wants and redirect the difference to savings, believing this represents superior financial discipline. While this is certainly an option for someone with strong, durable motivation, and some people genuinely do thrive with a more aggressive allocation, the framework's designers specifically chose 30% because it reflects a sustainable, realistic balance for the majority of people attempting to build a long-term financial habit. Not the theoretical maximum someone could save if willpower were unlimited and permanent. The honest distinction from needs. The test for whether something belongs in wants rather than needs is simple and can be applied to almost any expense. Would your basic life and ability to function be meaningfully impaired without this specific version of the expense? If the honest answer is no, if a more basic, less expensive version would still meet the underlying need, the difference between the two belongs in wants. Your action step. List your actual wants spending from the past month honestly, without judgment. Compare the total to 30% of your after-tax income. If it is significantly higher, that is useful information. Not a reason for guilt, but a clear signal of where the largest opportunity for adjustment, if needed, actually exists. The third number, 20%, is allocated to savings and debt repayment beyond the minimum, building wealth and reducing financial obligations. What belongs in this category? Building an emergency fund, contributions to a TFSA or RRSP, invested for long-term growth, extra payments toward debt, beyond the minimum required payment already counted in needs, specifically targeting faster payoff of credit cards, lines of credit, student loans, or other debt, saving toward specific major goals, a future home down payment, a major purchase, or any other deliberate savings target. Here is the vault from the opening. The single mistake that causes this framework to fail for almost everyone who first tries it. The mistake: treating savings as what's left over, instead of paying it first. Almost everyone who first attempts a budget, including the 50-30-20 framework specifically, makes the same critical error. They pay for needs, then spend on wants, and only afterward look at what remains to put toward the 20% savings category. Inevitably, because wants spending naturally expands to fill whatever is available, a well-documented behavioral tendency called lifestyle inflation. Covered extensively elsewhere on this channel, there is little or nothing left by the time savings is considered. The fix: pay yourself first. The 20% savings and debt category should be the very first allocation made when income arrives, not the last. In practice, this means setting up an automatic transfer of 20% of your after-tax income to your TFSA, RRSP, or extra debt payment, scheduled for the same day your paycheck is deposited, before any spending on wants, and ideally before most discretionary needs spending occurs as well. This single change in sequencing, savings first rather than savings last, is the difference between a budget that works for years and a budget that quietly fails within the first 1 to 2 months, with the person never quite identifying why. Why this sequencing matters so much psychologically. When savings happens automatically and first, the remaining 80%, needs and wants combined, becomes the only money psychologically available for spending decisions, removing the constant internal negotiation of "should I save this or spend it?" that occurs when savings is treated as a leftover. The decision is made once, automatically, rather than repeatedly and effortfully every time money arrives. A practical Canadian example, using round numbers for illustration: verify your own current TFSA contribution limits when implementing this. A Canadian earning $4,000 per month after tax, $2,000 to needs, $1,200 to wants, $800 to savings and debt. With that $800 automatically transferred to a TFSA-held investment account the same day the paycheck arrives, before any other spending occurs. Your action step: set up one automatic transfer today. Even a modest percentage, if 20%, feels unattainable immediately. Scheduled for the same day your income arrives. This single structural change is more important than getting the exact percentage perfectly right on day one. For a meaningful number of Canadians, particularly in higher cost-of-living cities or at lower income levels where essential costs consume a larger share of income by necessity, the 50-30-20 ratio simply does not fit as written. This section covers how to adapt it honestly, without abandoning the underlying framework. Adaptation 1. When needs genuinely exceed 50%. If your honest, strictly defined needs from Segment 1 exceed 50% of your income, which is common, especially in expensive housing markets, the most honest and useful first adaptation is to temporarily shift the ratio, for example to 60-20-20 or even 65-15-20, rather than pretending the standard ratio applies when it demonstrably does not for your specific circumstances. The non-negotiable principle to preserve, even when adapting. The savings and debt category should never be reduced to zero, even when it must shrink below 20%. Even a modest 5% to 10% savings rate, consistently applied and automated first, builds meaningful habits and modest progress, and is dramatically better than abandoning savings entirely until things get easier. A point that, for many people, never naturally arrives without deliberate action. Adaptation 2. When you are aggressively paying down high-interest debt. If you are carrying high-interest debt, credit cards, certain lines of credit, a temporary, deliberate shift toward a more aggressive debt paydown ratio, for example, 50-20-30, with the extra 10% redirected from wants to debt paydown, can be a sound, time-limited adaptation, given that eliminating high-interest debt produces a guaranteed return, the interest rate avoided, that often exceeds what could realistically be earned through other forms of saving during the same period. Adaptation 3. When you are early in a career with a strong expectation of rising income. For someone early in their career with a high confidence expectation of meaningfully rising income within a relatively short period, a likely near-term promotion, the completion of a relevant credential, or other concrete factors rather than vague hope. A temporarily larger needs allocation, with savings ramping up specifically as income rises rather than from day one, can be reasonable. Provided the increase to savings, when income does rise, is actually executed and not absorbed into lifestyle inflation, a pattern covered extensively in this channel's dedicated lifestyle inflation video. Adaptation 4. When you have dependents or significant caregiving responsibilities. Childcare, costs associated with supporting aging parents, or other caregiving-related expenses can legitimately push the needs category higher in a way that reflects genuine, unavoidable obligation rather than lifestyle choice. The framework's flexibility is specifically designed to accommodate this honestly, rather than forcing an artificial ratio that does not reflect real circumstances. The principle underlying every adaptation, the specific numbers, 50, 30, 20, are a starting reference point, proven to work well for a meaningful majority of people in typical circumstances, not a rigid law. The underlying principles that should be preserved in any adaptation are: every dollar should have an intentional, named purpose before it is spent. Savings, even when reduced, should never be eliminated entirely or treated as an afterthought. And the categorization should remain honest. Genuine needs versus genuine wants, even as the proportions shift to fit real circumstances. Your action step. If your initial attempt to apply the standard 50-30-20 ratios reveals that your needs significantly exceed 50%, do not abandon the framework. Adjust the ratios honestly to reflect your real circumstances, while preserving a non-zero, automated savings allocation as the one non-negotiable element. Let's come back to where we started. Most people who feel bad with money have never actually written down where their money goes. Now you have a complete, simple framework to fix that. 50% to needs, defined honestly and strictly. Housing, groceries, required transportation, minimum debt payments, necessary insurance. Not the upgraded, nicer version of any of these. The genuine minimum required to function. 30% to wants, deliberately, guiltlessly built into the framework. Because budgets with zero room for enjoyment fail far more often than budgets that include sustainable space for it. 20% to savings and debt repayment beyond the minimum, and critically, paid first, automatically, the same day income arrives. Not left as whatever happens to remain after needs and wants have already been spent. If your specific numbers do not fit 50/30/20 exactly, and for many Canadians, particularly in expensive housing markets, they will not, adapt the ratios honestly while preserving the three underlying principles. Every dollar gets an intentional purpose, savings is never reduced to zero, and the categories stay honestly defined rather than convenient. This is foundational evergreen content, specifically because it does not depend on this year's interest rates, this year's tax brackets, or any particular market condition. The framework works the same way whether income is rising or falling, whether markets are up or down. In any year you happen to be watching this. The simple first step, today: open a Notes app, a spreadsheet, or a piece of paper, and write down your actual income and your actual spending from the past 30 days, sorted honestly into these three categories. That single act, converting a vague feeling about money into specific written numbers, is the entire foundation this whole framework is built on.